All right, good morning, everyone. Afternoon, whichever time of the day it is. And welcome back for our next rendition of Being Human Church. So unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to volunteer today because they were a little bit short-staffed on personnel, but that's okay. We'll be back out here again next week and working on some of what they have for us to do. And it's been a great partnership thus far. Their signs are looking really nice. So today, with the upcoming election, I thought it would be good to talk about politics. Now, again, I don't want to talk about politics and the specific who's running on what platform and why those ideas are good or not good. What I want to do instead is talk about politics and government in general and consider what it is that they should be doing for us. Because I think in being drawn down to the details of the discussion and the tactical elements of whichever political campaign you're following, we've lost a little bit of our sight of the bigger picture. So first, I want to just talk about what politics is, right? Politics is wielding power at its very basic level. It's a group or an individual wielding power on behalf of the people, right? Particularly in a democracy or republic. They are the representative who wields the power of the people. But to what purpose? Today, it seems that political groups and the parties in particular are wielding the power of the people for their goals and not necessarily the goals that people have. And that's for a variety of reasons based on the construct, particularly in the US and also with many of the Western countries. But we should always ask ourselves, why is political power wielded the way it is? And is that the way that we want it to be wielded? So, is it just because? Is it just because our system is built this way and I guess that's the way it's going to be? Or is it that we are actually supposed to be wielding power to create a better society? And then when you say better society, you have to ask the question, for whom is that society better? Because that's something I think that's also really important to question, because a lot of times people get left out of that discussion, that better society discussion. So there's this idea from back in the days of nobility that nobles were obliged to care for the people that they basically lorded over. And so I think this is still true today, but it's true for all of us, not just those in power, that we have the obligation, and particularly as we gain education and status and power, that we are obliged to care for everyone else in our community, and everyone else in our country, and everyone else on our planet. And that's really what we stand for in Being Human Church, is taking that responsibility on ourselves to make the world better for ourselves, for our community, and for humanity. And so, but with that, we have to be careful, right? We have to be careful that we are not wielding this in our image, right? With an imperialist or an elitist ideal. Right? Oh, it should be this way because this is the way that it's always been for me, or it's the way it's been in Western culture. We have to really consider, what is it that we're doing? What are the consequences of our actions? And that requires a lot of thought, a lot of education, a lot of study. And so I think it's important as we work our way through what politics is for and how power should be wielded, that we are always critical of ourselves. And that's something, too, that is part of the humanist view, is that none of us are perfect, but in reflection and critical thought, we can help to craft a better idea or a better structure. And so one of the questions that we might ask is, do we have a responsibility to developing countries? Do we have a responsibility to the environment and to mitigate climate change? I would say that we do. And it's not out of some sense of necessarily civic duty or some law or treaty. I think it's really out of the fundamental idea that we're all human, and as of right now, we're all stuck on this planet. So we are obliged to help them, both because they are humans, just like us, but also because helping them helps us, right? It all comes back to the individual, because you really only know that you exist, right? I think, therefore I am. And therefore, you can only really view things through your own personal lens. But if you expand your mind enough, you realize that everything connects to you. And so while you could look at it from a very narrow, self-centered individual lens, what we should be doing is opening what affects the individual and opening that aperture to see that everything affects us. And so wielding that obligation to help others is what ultimately helps us. And so what do people really need, right? So we're wielding power in politics. And what do humans need to survive? To me, I think it's just three things. Might be wrong, but this is what I've considered. You need energy, resources, and time, right? So energy, the sun or electricity or whatever it happens to be, gives us the ability to manipulate our environment, to grow food, to provide shelter. Same thing with resources. Those two things kind of combine together to provide for the physical world that we need to live. And then the second piece of that is time. And time, to me, is one of the most valuable assets that we have, because that's the thing that you use to invest in yourself, to make yourself better, to make your community better. But if we spend all of our time simply providing for our basic resources, we're never actually moving the ball forward. We're simply sustaining the status quo. And so what we should be doing with politics is providing for an abundance of energy and resources and an abundance of free time. Now, throughout history, if you look at the Renaissance in particular, many of the people who advanced science were nobles, people with money, people with resources, and people with time. They had the time to sit around and think and to be bored and to wonder, why does the apple fall from the tree? So if we really want humanity to advance, we need to enable as many people as we can to spend their time thinking about that next advance. Any one of us across the entire world could come up with the next idea that prevents catastrophic climate change, or the next idea that helps us to become an intergalactic species. But if we have everybody tied down with just scraping by in a system that's not just unequal, because any system is going to have inequality, but so unequal that they're basically enslaved to that system, that's not advantageous. And I'm not talking about capitalism or communism or socialism, but we should just be looking at our systems at providing these basic things, an abundance of energy, resources, and time, so that as a human race, we are spending the majority of our resources advancing as opposed to sustaining. So then what should the purpose of politics and government be? Foster a society that increases those energy, resources, and time. The next thing is promote stability, right? And stability is very closely tied with inequality. We've seen throughout history when inequality becomes too great, societies become unstable. The Roman Empire, France before the Revolution, inequality was astronomical. You look at the Great Depression, right, caused by huge amounts of inequality. So that doesn't mean that everything should be perfectly equal, right? Because we know that that's an almost impossible thing to achieve. Nor is it something that I think appeals to our sense of fairness and justice as individuals. And a lot of times I think the energy we would spend making it perfectly even would be contrary to this idea of abundance. But we have to have that sense of stability. And there has to be some forces that mitigate dramatic inequality, which then increases instability. That's one of the purposes of government, right? So in the preamble to the Constitution, which is just one example of building a society, you have, it starts with, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, which in this case actually meant well-being, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, which means our future generations. That's basically what we just talked about, making sure that we have abundance, stability, justice, fairness, right? So the basic human rights. But I think we've gotten really far off of those targets. I think we've lost sight of the things that we are trying to provide with the construct of our government. So how do we get back on track? So these are some of the things that I want you all to consider as we move forward. It's not about winning this or that fight or this or that, particular topic of whatever it happens to be. What I think it's about is restructuring how we are represented. So one is advocate for better representation. There's a good article that I'll link later that talks about changing the number of representatives in the House. The number of representatives in the House is currently constrained by a simple law, just a congressional law, not the Constitution. So the Constitution says that there will be basically no fewer than one representative per 30,000 people, right? That was when it was originally built. So it also says they have to be equally proportioned by the census of the states, right? So there's just a law that Congress passed that says the number will be 435 representatives in the House. So to change it, all they would need to do is create a new law. In this article, it actually talks about there's a specific number that's kind of at a good equilibrium. I think it's 935, that makes the representation in the US the most representative. Because right now, the number of, for instance, electoral votes in Wyoming is like 1 per 172,000 people. And in California, it's 1 for every 700,000 people. So dramatically different. And by increasing the number of representatives, you get smaller districts, which makes it harder to gerrymander. You reduce the number of people per representative so that they can actually represent more accurately their whatever their constituency is. And then at that level, you have the ability to better know your representative, to be better connected to them. And again, all it takes is a simple law. Now, we know nothing is easy. I'm not saying it's an easy law, but it is simple. All they have to do is say the number of representatives is now at this, and probably for the subsequent election, whether that's 2020 or whatever it happens to be, states would then have to draw districts and figure out how to do the voting for those. Which leads to our next one. States control how our nominees or our delegates are processed into being able to be voted for. States create the rules. So for instance, when we have primaries are actually even exist outside of the state system, other than they provide polling places, right? Because those are for the parties, which aren't official parts of government, which some people may not know. But the states actually create the rules, and there's, I think, a newer and better way to vote for people, right? So right now we have what we call the first past the post system. So, or the majority wins. So of the people who vote, whoever gets the majority, they win. Regardless if that number, when you consider the state total, is actually a minority. So a lot of people can win now with less than 50% of the total vote, depending on how electors are chosen and whatnot. But you can do instant runoff voting or ranked choice voting. So right now you can choose one or the other, basically, because most people are afraid of the other side. So what a lot of people are doing when they vote is choosing the least bad candidate. Because they want to prevent the other side from getting in power because they're worried about what that side will do. So we'll choose the least bad one to us. And what that's allowed to happen is we just continue getting worse and worse candidates, regardless of what side you're on, and we keep choosing just the least bad of those based on our ideas. But what if you could vote for the candidate that you actually wanted without being afraid of wasting your vote? That's what ranked choice voting is. When you go into the polling place, on your ballot is however many candidates there are running for a given position. It could be 2, it could be 12. And you have the ability to go in there and rank number 1, 2, 3, etc., the people that you want voted into office. So let's say there's a third-party candidate that you really like, that really represents what you're looking for. In our current construct, you would be worried about voting for them because you would be afraid of wasting your vote. Because you'd be taking a vote away from the least bad candidate and potentially allowing the worst candidate from your viewpoint to win. But with an instant runoff system, you'd be able to vote for your number 1, and then if your number 1 does not get enough votes, say they're at the very bottom of the list, well, your vote's not wasted They just take all the votes that were for that candidate and they go to their number 2. So then maybe it's your least bad that wins, or it keeps going down until someone then has a majority of votes. What this would do, at least in theory, is provide for a larger diversity of candidates to run. Because anybody has a chance of winning at that point, because we don't have people considering, well, will my vote be wasted? Your vote will always be counted. And there's no necessarily need to rank 1 through 12. You can rank whatever number you want. And then, if it gets down way past that point, then at that point, I guess your vote would be wasted, but you have the option. I think this would get us away from a lot of the political division and the polarization that we see today. Because what we have is people catering to this very small number of voters that actually vote in the primaries. Because we've created a vetting system now that ensures that your candidates are going to be as far apart as possible to capture the primaries, to then be considered as the main 2 candidates. Because then we're in the system where people are afraid of wasting their vote. So states can actually make this happen. You can advocate today, here in Louisiana, for instance, they actually have this for runoff elections. So they have instant runoff. Not for all of the elections, but that's something you can advocate for. Is in every election, you should advocate, I personally think, but definitely go out and research it and consider it, this idea of instant runoff or ranked choice voting. So with those 2 things together, I think we'd see a dramatic shift in the type and number of representatives that we would see. I definitely think the increasing number of representatives is harder because, of course, the people in Congress are happy with the way the current system works. Some of you may know that 80% of incumbents get reelected throughout the history of Congress. 80%. That means they have to do not that much to get reelected, because a lot of times people will go with the known bad as opposed to bringing in an unknown bad. So what else can we do? I think what we should be doing, particularly in the majority, which is most people who are in the center and not in the polarized sides, is speak more often. This is contrary to everything that's built into our societal norms and polite company, right? Politics is one of the things you're not supposed to talk about in polite company. But I think if we did, and I think if we did it reasonably and not trying to necessarily win everybody over, but just to give people a sense that there are far more people in the middle than there are on the sides, then I think we would have a bit more moderate conversation, because, again, we would realize that we're actually in the majority, not in the minority. Most people want just a stable society with reasonable economic benefits that people can get access to. People don't want one crazy thing on this side and one crazy thing on this side. They pretty much want the middle. And then we keep moving that middle forward wherever it goes. Another thing I think we have to be cautious of is parties. George Washington, in his farewell address, warned against parties because he realized that they would attempt to manipulate and save power for themselves. And I think he was very right. I think he was very prescient for someone who was in power more than 200 years ago. So I wanted to read you a couple of excerpts from his farewell address that I think are really, really important to hear today. And especially as many people in either of the parties love to quote and try and channel what our forefathers thought. This is a direct quote from his farewell address. In contemplating the causes which may disturb our union, it occurs as a matter of serious concern that any ground should have been furnished for characterizing parties by geographical discriminations, northern and southern, Atlantic and western, whence designing men may endeavor to excite a belief that there is a real difference of local interests and views. One of the expedients of party to acquire influence within particular districts is to misrepresent the opinions and aims of other districts. You cannot shield yourselves too much against the jealousies and heartburnings which spring from these misrepresentations. They tend to render alien to each other those who ought to be bound together by fraternal affection. And he goes on to say, all obstructions to the execution of all of the laws, all combinations and associations, under whatever plausible character, with the real design to direct, control, counteract, or awe the regular deliberation and action of the constituted authorities, are destructive of this fundamental principle and of fatal tendency. They serve to organize faction, to give it an artificial and extraordinary force, to put in the place of delegated will of the nation the will of a party, often a small but artful and enterprising minority of the community, and according to the alternative triumphs of different parties, to make the public administration the mirror of the ill-concerted and incongruous projects of faction, rather than the organ of consistent and wholesome plans digested by the common councils and modified by mutual interests. However, combinations or associations of the above description may now and then answer popular ends, they are likely, in the course of time and things, to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterward the very engines which had lifted them to unjust dominion. The alternate dominion of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enmities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. Without looking forward to an extremity of this kind, which nevertheless ought not to be entirely out of sight, the common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it the interest and duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. It serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasional riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which finds a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. Thus, the policy and the will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another. He concludes by saying, "Observe good faith and justice toward all nations, and cultivate peace and harmony with all." So when researching today's topic, I came across that because I remember reading something about it a long time ago, and I was a little bit shaken by how precise that description is of today's political environment. And so if one of our most cherished presidents in all of our history has said this, I think we should listen and consider very closely how it is we are engaging in our political conversation today. So I would ask that you take that back and consider that as we go into this election. Are we engaging with dispassion, or are we channeling the fervor of our party? Are we looking what is good for the country or what is good for our party? And I really think that we should advocate for the dissolution of power, particularly from party, on both sides or on all sides, and try and bring some of the power back to the people for whom the country was built. So with that, I thank you for listening today. I hope it's given you something to consider as we go into election week. And I'd like to close, as we always do, by asking if someone has something that they are grateful for from the previous week, and something they're looking forward to in the week to come. I know for me personally, my son was very sick last night, and we took him to the hospital, and I am grateful that I have medical care for him, and that I was able to get him seen and treated, because he was having a hard time breathing, and that's a terrifying thing for a parent to go through. And so I'm incredibly grateful that we live in a country and we have those resources in my family available to be able to get him that treatment. And I also know that everyone else does not have that. So that's my thing that I am incredibly grateful for this week. And in the week to come, I look forward to my mom coming down to visit, to see the grandkids and to watch them. So that's what I'm really looking forward to. Unfortunately, I live far from my mom, so I don't get the chance to see her that often. Does anyone else have something that they would love to share this week? Eric. Nice. Yeah? Okay. Yeah. Awesome. Now let us know what you think about those. So let us know what you think about those as you read them. So Eric was grateful. He broke 500 crunches as he's working to rehabilitate and do a little bit of physical therapy. So that's great. Anyone else? Brandon. Nice. Not bad. Awesome. Yeah, so Brandon did a half marathon. You said 2 hours and 4 minutes. That's a very solid time. He's going to see his son this coming week, so something to look forward to. Anyone else care to share? Absolutely. Okay. All right. So Katie said she was thankful for going to the state fair, which is put on by our wonderful Shreveport downtown. What is it again? Oh, okay. Excellent. Yeah, so the Downtown Development Authority had put together a food crawl through the fair, basically. And she got to meet a lot of new people, which is awesome. And then she's looking forward to spending time with her mom, which is always a good thing to do. All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming. I hope you have a wonderful week. Next week, we're going to have a little bit different engagement. I will actually be out of town for the next 2 weeks, but we're going to facilitate some conversation between you all and see what you all think about some different topics. So thank you very much again for coming, and we look forward to seeing you in the future.